All right, hey everyone, it's Brian. I hope this video finds you all doing really well. So thank you as always so much for taking the time to watch one of your final RLI 6 sessions together. This one on advocating to accelerate change. So just a little backstory about this session. This session came about because I happen to wear two really different hats in my work, and I'm not remembering if I ever mentioned this. So one, as you all know already, is as a leadership and organizational development fanatic. Like, I love supporting leaders and teams to function better based on evidence-based practices, on practices that are more liberating and emancipatory. And the other hat is as a community organizer who works with folks coming from historically disinvested, excluded communities to build campaigns for social change. So I know what you're thinking. That is pretty weird, Brian, right? But those two different hats have led to a really critical insight for me over time, which is this. It's that in my leadership development hat, I get to help health systems teams to function better. And to be honest, I find that a lot of teams feel disempowered, if not disconnected, from influencing the systemic and structural issues that lead to poor health, that lead to poor health inequities. But conversely, in my community organizer hat, I get to help individuals do exactly that, act directly on broken systems, broken policies and structures through impacting policy change. And what's odd is that I find that what impedes most campaigns aren't decision makers or leaders getting in the way and saying no. It's actually that supporting newly formed teams, newly formed groups of folks to come together to collaborate effectively is really, really hard. It's really hard work to do change making and advocacy work. So what I found is that the intersection of those two worlds, right? Organizational development, of restructuring the inner workings of teams that we're on, in this case, in health systems. And two, community organizing, of restructuring the world out there by mobilizing people, by mobilizing teams, is why when we put those together, like relational leadership does, it's such a critical tool. I think particularly critical in these times that we find ourselves in. So in that spirit, with this session, we are shifting gears to advocate to accelerate change. A couple of frameworks that I want to just acknowledge up front. First, in RLI, when we talk about advocacy, we're not talking about just legislative advocacy or what I sometimes call like capital A advocacy, like marching with rallies at the Capitol. We're talking about all levels of change making. So perhaps it's increasing awareness of frontline staff well-being at our workplace, or maybe it's implementing more structural competency curricula, racial justice curricula in our training environment. Or yes, maybe it is going to City Hall, to the state capitol to address climate and environmental justice. It can be any of those things. We're talking about advocacy, change making at all levels. None is better or worse than the others. Second framework that I want to share with you all, and this one is key. I think in healthcare that we've created this myth, and this myth is that great change happens because of great individuals. You know, the great surgeon, the great diagnostician, the great researcher, the great teacher, the great program director. I'm sure if you reflected, you could think about this narrative, that this myth that you've heard before. If you're anything like me, you might go about your day hearing about it multiple times. But I don't know about you, but I have been brought up to think that change, particularly social change, comes from great individuals alone, right? Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, Winona LaDuke, Cesar Chavez, on and on. Folks who are superhuman and singularly accomplish superhuman things. It's how we learn history and how we learn about change. And let me be clear, it is 100% unequivocally true that these leaders that I mentioned are exceptionally brilliant, exceptionally talented, ingenious folks. And the point I'm trying to make is that I'm asking us to examine how the leaders are presented in our culture and how they don't tell the full story. That an unintended byproduct of learning history in this way is that because a lot of us, we don't feel connected to be social leaders. We feel that we don't have the power to cause change. Because I don't know about you, but there is no way in heck, no way that I would ever be able to organize 300,000 people to show up, turn out, and march in DC around a social cause. So then we're trained to think we must wait for the next exceptional leader to create the world we seek, right? To create the world that we imagine. And the fuller truth is that this framing of history, it actually betrays sociological research that has found that the greatest change of the last century has happened not because of great individuals, but because of great communities. Things like the civil rights movements, women's rights movements, LGBTQ movements have all had strong core communities, strong teams in the middle of them. Now, what folks like Martin Luther King Jr. were actually doing in between speeches, what Rosa Parks did after she sat on that bus in Montgomery in 1955, was build up teams, build up new leaders, build new kinds of relationships, like bringing, for example, Grace Lee Boggs, a leading Asian American activist, alongside the civil rights movement. And that story doesn't always get told. So the point I'm trying to make is that we don't need to peek too far under the hood of change making, of advocacy, from the greatest changes over the last century to see that we have been sold sometimes a myth that great change happens when we make change for others. When the reality is, I believe great change happens when we make change not for others, but with others, alongside of them, lifting others up as we climb. So the goal in this session is for us to reframe our fundamental unit of change making from singular individuals developing exceptional leaders to that of teams, that teams are the fundamental unit of change, developing a committed group of people around a shared values, and ask ourselves what possibilities open up to us because of building communities and strong, vibrant teams. That the exceptional work done by key leaders, whether it's in historical national movements, in Flint, Michigan around the water crisis, in organized tribal efforts to preserve land and water use, has been building new forms of public relationships out there in the world that employ everyday folks like myself, perhaps like you, to let them know that they are capable of creating a whole new world of creating change. And that's the case that I ultimately want to make to you all today. That all the skills that you've been learning over the last 2 months together here at RLI has given you much of the foundational tools to do exactly this. So, huge fat caveat that I just have to throw in there right now. Advocacy, yeah, it's a huge, huge topic. We would likely need to build a whole entirely new RLI 2.0 to cover it. But instead, we get one tiny recorded session. So the focus is going to be a little bit smaller. The focus is going to be on number one, shifting our collective mindsets to approach power and change in completely different ways. And number two is that we want to support you to use some already learned relational leadership skills already in your toolbox right now to support those ways of approaching power and change in these new ways. So with that, in today's session, we're going to do a couple of things. We're going to first level set on the kind of power that we're trying to generate to build relationship-driven change. Then we're going to draw upon our existing relational leadership skills to not only rebuild new ways of operating as a team, but of pointing that team then that you have towards change, right? Framing that team that you have to change. Then in the next video, got good news. You won't see me, you'll see Matt Lewis. Matt Lewis is back, which is great. Matt is going to help us build upon our existing narrative leadership skills on story of self towards sharing how stories can be a critical and often forgotten, underused component of change making and advocacy. Finally, we'll wrap up some concrete examples and we'll close out. So let's dive into our session today, power. One of the goals of relational leadership is to accelerate change. That's why we're at this session. And creating change, I would argue, whether we know it or not, involves creating power. So it's really important for us to talk about power, to look at it right in the face, because we need to know what kind of power we're building. And I want to argue that it's especially important to talk about power in health systems, because power is everywhere, right? Because we have all the hierarchical power dynamics and isms that exist out there in the world, in society. And I would say we have one extra layer of the traditional power paradigm that exists within the walls of healthcare, right? The unique power dynamics of supervisors over staff, the unique power dynamics of trainers, instructors, teachers that may have over learners, students, the power of clinicians and researchers that they may have over patients, research subjects, and community members. So I believe we need to surface and discuss power much more frequently in health systems. And hopefully you've seen that peek through a couple of times in RLI already. So I want to ask you a question. When I say the word power, how does that make you feel? And Alexander did a little bit of this in our collaborative decision-making session, but I just want you to meaning make in the moment. What feelings, emotions come up for you when I say the word power? Quick story that I want to share with you about power. In between my 3rd and 4th year of medical school, back home in Minnesota, I did a public health year. I loved it. It was maybe one of the best years of my life. Throughout the year, what I did was I worked on a thesis that was a systematic lit review on the impacts of the patient-centered primary care home on historically excluded communities. I worked really hard on it the whole year, worked with one of my mentors. By the end of the year, we had some preliminary findings that my mentor and I thought that we could publish. And so we were finishing this manuscript, finished it up, had a penultimate draft. And we're like, we should really get another set of expert eyes on it. We're not experts on this stuff. So we found a health systems guru that was at our institution. We asked him, hey, could you review this for us? We got it back, and he had put his name actually as the first author on the title page. And I was like, oh, that's weird. It must have been a slip up or a typo, or he must have just been misplacing where his name was. But I was really glad. I was kind of honored that he wanted to be a co-author. So I put him back second. I was like, yeah, that's great. But a couple hours later, I'm doing homework, get an email. It's an angry email. And he had written back this really infuriating, horrible email. And he closed by saying, Brian, one day you're going to have an opportunity to write lots of first author papers. I'll tell you what, now is not that day. I remember reading that email. I looked at his signature line on the email. It was his academic title, professor, director of a center on his byline. And it was this eye-opening, awakening moment for me of awakening to my identity and power dynamics that I was just swimming in and wasn't always aware of in academia. So power can mean a lot of different things. I'm sure it surfaced a lot of different emotions in you. But there's a tendency in our world for power to show up negatively. And I think that's why, you've probably heard of that quote by Lord Acton about power and corruption. Have you heard of that quote before? It's that quote that goes, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Right? I'm sure you've heard of it. You know what's interesting about that quote? I learned like a year ago that the actual quote, it actually goes, power tends to corrupt, and absolute power tends to corrupt absolutely. And the key word there is tend. But over time, because of power, how it tends to show up so negatively, hierarchically over time, we've just gone away and done away with the word tend. It's just power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And it doesn't have to be this way, right? As relational leaders, I believe we have a responsibility to guard against that tendency. And that quote is also a reminder that though we can't be powerless if we want change, that we need to build our own power if we want change. So let's talk a little bit more about that concept. Think about the moments in your life, in your professional life, in your life as perhaps a student, as a trainee, that you felt that negative kind of power that I outlined with this health systems guru, getting that email, the kind of email that I received then, the kind of power I experienced in that moment. Bring it up in your mind's eye. I've labeled it as a power over dynamic that you see in that orange box on the left. What words would you use to describe that kind of power? What does it look like? What does it feel like? So I did this for myself. Here were the words that I came up with. So I said, controlling, secretive, exclusive, divisive, hierarchical, words that we've kind of used throughout RLI about some of the dominant paradigms of leadership. And left unchecked, there are unfortunately several instances in the waters that you and I tend to swim in where we and our colleagues around us may be left to feel this way on the left-hand column. So to me, it begs the question, is there even another way? So let's move over to that right-hand side, which I've labeled as a power with dynamic, engaging, open, inclusive, solidarity, transformative. Think to yourself, what are other words that you might use to describe this kind of power? Heck, is it even possible? Right? I'm curious, when have you experienced this kind of power? I can tell you, one of the most potent times I experienced this kind of power was about 4 years ago when Andrew Morsinger, you met him during the teaming session, he and I, we went around and did one-to-one meetings with folks all across health systems in Portland. And as we did those one-to-ones, something interesting happened where we just kept hearing from folks across all disciplines, all different kinds of healthcare settings, that they were just craving, they had an appetite for a different way of leading, a different way of being together at work, a way that was focused on people, on connection, on relationships. And so over time, we built this ragtag crew of an interprofessional core team. It had Marcel, it had a medical student, it had this amazing nursing faculty. And we were meeting regularly at night, on a weeknight after work, to try and work to launch RLI. And I would come home bleary-eyed after a 15-hour shift as a resident in the hospital and log into a phone meeting with a huge smile on my face. And what I was feeling in that moment was power with. Power with these folks who I felt like were kindred spirits in this work. Sometimes we don't think of this when we experience this as power, but it is. It absolutely is. So another way of thinking about this is unilateral power on the left, or what some in the community organizing world call the world as it is. That if we do nothing and we leave power towards its tendency, it's unilateral power. That's the world as it is. And what we're trying to do is seek and nudge and work and shift the paradigms towards the right-hand side, which is relational power on the right, or what we sometimes call the world as it should be. And when we work to create power for change, we live in the tension, in the agitational space in between the world as it is and the world as it should be. I'm curious, I wonder if you know where the word power came from. I only know one Latin word. That's not true. I know sic transit gloria because it was in a movie. I think it means glory face. I think it was in the movie Rushmore. Anyways, I know a couple of Latin words. One of the ones I know is the Latin word for power. And it's posse. And posse means the ability to act. Or my favorite definition of power came from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who said, power is the ability to achieve purpose. So then, friends, we can either act unilaterally to achieve our purpose or act relationally to achieve our purpose. As relational leaders, the choice is ours, truly. And I believe that as relational leaders, this is exactly our responsibility, to reclaim the relational aspect of power. The arms-linked power with model is what we're seeking for. So you might be sitting there saying, yes, sounds great, Brian. How the heck do we do that? So the good news is, I would say that you have already learned a lot of the foundational skills through RLI to build exactly this kind of power with. So let's look at this a little bit. In a way, RLI thus far has been about offering an array of individual tools that stand alone, right? Maybe it's scheduling a one-to-one, or going to the balcony with a 5 dynamics lens for your team, or transforming conflict that's really sticky with a colleague. And you can employ each of these skills individually, right? You can pick out your RLI toolbox, pick out each one, all in service of leading and teaming, right? I've had a number of one-to-one meetings with Callie, with Alexander. Marcel and I have been on a team for a long time, so we talk about storming on a team, and then we'll do conflict transformation together after we get into an argument or disagree on something. And it's almost like the individual skills that you've learned in RLI have been framed through the lens of the organizational development, leadership development hat I wear that I was telling you about at the beginning of this session, which looks to change our individual mindsets about what collaboration could look like and our interpersonal relationships with our teammates. And you'll see that those are the first 2 levels of change. So RLI is standalone skill sets. They can transform individuals, they can transform our interpersonal relationships. What we're talking about today with advocacy, it's a little different, right? It's an intentional sequencing intentionally of RLI skills through the lens of change making, right? And it's through that lens of almost community organizing hat that I wear, to build a team of passionate individuals to do the critical work of maintaining that team and then mobilizing that team to act together for change. And you can sequence them intentionally in service of creating institutional and systemic change, which you see on the right side. So I don't know if you're a cook, but it's almost like so far in RLI, you've been learning how to finely chop carrots, you've been learning how to properly braise meats, and how to make a broth, and you've been learning them all individually, and they're all fine individual skills. Advocacy, change making, those are all integrating those skills to make a meal. It's almost like you're making an RLI stew. It's a good thing I had dinner because otherwise I get hungry for stew right now. So we're trying to integrate all these skills intentionally and sequence them, all in service of mobilizing your fundamental unit of change, a team for change. So this slide is likely really familiar to you by now. We've presented it in every RLI session as kind of like our RLI syllabus. And it's all the topics you have and will cover throughout RLI as a program. But what it might not capture is how these skills articulate with one another for advocacy and change making. And that, my friends, is where the change maker cycle comes in. So let me just go through this really quickly, because a lot of these, like I said, are old skills that you're just articulating, bringing together and sequencing in new ways. So the first thing on the top there is that you're going to start with listening. What I mean by that is that you're going to go around trying to find and listen for passions and problems that are felt by others in your community. Maybe that's your team, maybe that's your clinic, your hospital, your research team, classmates, maybe it's your neighborhood. And in that process, you're going to identify other people who share your values, who share your interests, who share your passion. And over time, because of that shared interest, you're going to build a core team of like-minded, like-hearted people who want to work with you for the change you seek out in the world. And what that does, leading with listening, is that it hyper-focuses in on a power with frame. That people who are directly impacted by something or personally passionate about an issue, they're going to drive the change that you seek. And the technique that we use to do this, as you see, is a one-to-one meeting, right? We engage in one-to-one meetings to listen, elicit stories, surface stories about what people are personally invested in, what they care about, their self-interest, what they're deeply impacted by on a day-to-day basis. I remember one of my mentors in community organizing, he said, Brian, it's not the issue, it's the people, right? It's not about building campaigns around interesting problems. It's about finding the people who care about them, that want to work with you to act on them and to change them. And that's what listening, that's what one-to-one meetings allows us to do, is build that connection, that relationship over shared values. And that's like social glue, right? Social super glue. All right, then on the right, you'll see team maintenance, maintaining a team. And you are now maestros at this because of RLI. So you found a group of passionate individuals who want to act with you on a problem. And so now you're in the hard work of inculcating the values of not just helping them to function optimally, but to live out the relationship-based values that they seek out in the world. And that's about keeping that team together. You found individual people who are all passionate about an issue you're passionate about. How do you create a team around that? So the techniques that you'll employ, there's a lot of them, and you're going to intentionally pull out from that RL relational leadership toolbox to meet your new team's specific needs and move them from forming, storming, norming to performing, right? So I don't need to tell you this. New committees, new core teams, new student groups, that's hard. That's hard work to maintain that, right? Particularly when they're designed and pointing towards addressing hairy systemic issues. I'm sure that we can all think of committees, groups, teams that we've left due to high degrees of dysfunction. And what we're hoping is that those RLI tools that you see on the right there next to team maintenance has given you a lot of the tools to help maintain teams in healthy, optimal, and relationship-based ways to create new norms, practices, and team culture. So you're going to get in the process of building that fundamental unit of change, which is a team. Then you move towards the bottom there, which is mobilizing. You want to mobilize that team to act for the change that you want to see. So now that you've built that highly functioning unit of change, a team, you're going to mobilize that team to act, to work with decision makers to create the change that you want to see. So the techniques that you'll do here is, it's interesting. A lot of change models are predicated on having almost an antagonizing relationship with decision makers, right? Maybe you send an email off requesting a policy change to a leader that you've never met with. Or maybe it's a letter writing campaign that doesn't really quite create room for dialogue and shared understanding the values, the pressures that leaders face. Or maybe it's like proposal submissions that don't allow space for discussing shared values, right? Not very relational. It's just like an antagonizing way of change sometimes, which also can be very effective, but we want to get you in the space of being relational. So that's why we encourage having one-to-ones with decision makers, right? Because doing that, it allows you to identify and appeal to the shared values that are shared between the core team that you've built and the decision maker, right? What we know in healthcare, what we will definitely do, we'll appeal to the head, right? We'll come with the data. We'll come with a logic-driven, strategic proposal. What we want to invite you to do is also appeal not just to the head, but to the heart. And that happens with stories. That happens with identifying shared values between you, your core team, and the leader. And that's where you're not just going to use a story of self. You're also now in a moment going to learn about something called the story of us and now, which are really potent, amazing tools for change making. So in the next video, in a couple of minutes, Matt's going to explain this new concept of connecting your story of self with the story of us and now to point your team, that fundamental unit of change, towards change making, towards advocacy. The last step in the change maker cycle, as you see on the left, is reflect. The objective here is to celebrate getting the change that you worked for with your team, maybe reflecting on the reasons why you didn't get the change that you sought after, celebrating new leaders that you've developed, new relationships you've developed in the process, and considering next steps. Maybe you decide, okay, we need to go back to listening. What other issues are there? Who are new team members that we can engage? And the cycle continues. And you're going to get a taste of this reflect part actually in real time, not in this session, but in our last session on closure. You're going to see that the intentional act of team closure, of engaging in intentional reflection with your team, can be powerful. It can be one of the most impactful gifts that you can give to another person. So you'll get to see that too. But for today, what I want to share is as you look at this change maker cycle, you have the tools to engage in broad listening, build a core team. You have all the tools to then maintain that core team. And what you're going to learn about today are more skills to build on one-to-ones, to build on your story of self, to mobilize your team to act. By now, you all are just amazing people at building and maintaining a team because of the skills that you've learned at RLI. What we want to layer on top of that today is then mobilizing and igniting that team to act. And that's exactly what Matt Lewis is going to talk to you about right now.